And so ultimately, that is saying that we are self-interested. So on the converse of that is humility, saying that I will sacrifice anything that comes from this for the humility. And so the last shall be first and the first shall be last. What does that mean? Is I believe the number one leadership trait in the next generation in the future, and I would say even throughout history, is humility.
Hello and welcome to ReedFlections. I'm Art Calderon, and you're here to learn about life, leadership, and learning. We're glad you're here, and I'm here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a CEO of a global franchising security firm headquartered here in the heartland of America. He's a husband, a father, now a published author, and he's going to share some ideas with us as he's done going into the second season now, several episodes. Season 2, all about developing authentic and intentional leaders. And episodes 1 through 4 we call Why Develop Leaders? Why Develop Leaders? Episode 3 is Facilitate Exponential Growth of People and Organizations. Exponential being the key word here. Now, Reed, tell us, what do leaders do to help build exponential growth in others and their organizations?
Well, first and foremost, I think that the exponential component of our investment in any capacity is the most gratifying. So if we do anything and we see it multiply by 100-fold, it's way better than just duplication. Like, oh, I created one leader.
Simple math.
Simple math, right? In any sense. And so I think this is a critical component from that standpoint. And as any leader or any person would like to do, they'd like to multiply their effort, and exponential is that component. And so ultimately, how do we create exponential leadership, and what is the value of that is the form of your question. I think first and foremost, we have to first look to create exponential growth. Part of the trap we have is we like to share advice. We want to give our opinions. But if we're doing that, we can help someone, but it's not exponential. But if we're looking to create exponential growth, would our answer be different? Right? And so it's fishing for someone or teaching someone to fish. If you're fishing for someone, that's a piece of advice. If you're just giving them a piece of fish, it's like, here's a piece of advice. Go and you can use this as you see fit. However, you're teaching them to fish, they may eat for a lifetime. That's an exponential piece. So then saying, wait a minute, they're asking because they're hungry, right? They're hungry for growth. They're hungry for learning. And if I am a leader that intends to develop exponentially, I'd say, you're hungry today, but I know you're hungry every couple of hours.
Oh, you bet. I'm kind of hungry now.
Okay, well, I should teach you how to fish. And so I think ultimately that is the difference, right? And so we say, in an organization, you may just want me to give you an assignment or a task. But if I teach you how to discern what the next assignment or task might be, then I'm training you for exponential growth and preparing you. Now let's speak, and I'm trying to, in this series, look at from both the person that's developing someone that they want to develop exponentially, but also the person receiving that same information. And I think, as someone that's receiving that teaching to fish, we're like, I'm starving now. Don't teach me how to fish. I just want to get the fish right now. Go get your rod and reel and whatever you're doing and give that to somebody else, because I don't want to do that because I'm really hungry right now. And what we need to say is, okay, it may take me longer to learn how to fish and reel my own in, even if I am hungry, but at the same time, it'll serve me much longer than being fed a fish. And so as a employee or someone that's receiving that training and teaching and coaching, we're going to say, just give me a task. Then I know exactly what you expect of me. And then as soon as I do that in that period of time, I will be able to run up to you and say, look, I finished the task. Instead, we need to be focused and say, wait a minute, I think there's a broader principle here that I need to learn. And so a movie that I watched as I was growing up that I think kind of illustrates that well was Karate Kid. And I think many people have seen, Ralph Macchio in the back painting the fence. And Mr. Miyagi, who was a wise old exponential leader, because he exponentially made dollars off of that only success he had, and then ultimately parlayed it into a Netflix series that is now 30 years later. So I think that's exponential if we look at it that way. That's a lot of growth, because that movie resonated, right? That movie resonated because on the other side, we saw that he was like, why am I painting the fence? What's the purpose? Just you're assigning a task to me, is the way Ralph Macchio saw that. But what, Mr. Miyagi saw was like, no, I'm teaching you principles and muscle memory and processes that you'll use in another context later. And that's how you get exponential growth. And so that is ultimately why we want to do it. And then as the leader, we want to teach exponential growth even when the person is asking for a task. Conversely, if we're getting trained, we don't want to be fixated on the task. We need to say, wait a minute, I need to step back and learn this so I can apply it in other contexts.
So sometimes, especially in business, you just want the task. You just want, look, tell me what to do. It's 4:30 on a Friday. I want to finish this up and call it a day, right? But if you're developing leaders, you want to train them, as you said, for the long term. You want to give them a skill, something that's transferable. So ultimately will help them grow, help the organization grow, and maybe even help people that they lead grow, right? So what are some examples of that you see in your everyday running a business as you do?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts of that. First, this goes back to the earlier podcast we had, which is saying select the right leader. Because there are people that are just happy doing a task.
Right.
They want to come in,
And you need
clock in.
people
You
like
need
that, right?
people like
Yeah.
that. Absolutely. I mean, as I counsel young professionals, and I said, where do you get the greatest enjoyment? Some of them is just task completion. They want to check the box. I'll give an example. My wife loves the gratification of checking a box. And so if there's things to do around the house and she's already done it, like take out the trash, she will take out the trash and then she hasn't created her list. So then she'll write, take out the trash, check. And so I was like, you already did it. You don't need to even
I
waste the
do that.
time to
I
write
do
it
that.
down. And so I recognize there's parts of our audience that are that individual
Uh-huh.
and she loves it.
Uh-huh.
And then I do see, however, there's a task list for me. I'm like, oh,
with no checks.
and yeah. And I see his and hers,
Yeah.
and I mean, his are things that hers doesn't want to do. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the manager in that scenario. At the same time, I don't work that way, right? I want to understand why. So if we go back to the start of that question, which is we got to select the people that we want to invest in.
In a business setting, you want to make sure you have chosen someone and put someone in a place of leadership that already sees that. You maybe explain one time, but
That's
you don't
right.
have to come back and keep explaining this thing that needs to be done. They should already see it.
And so where do we start with that in a business setting? We look at it the more frequent, the more we need to train them on the why. It goes back to the fishing.
Okay.
We need to eat regularly. So back to the daily. If it's something that happens daily and you're a manager, let's say, managers should work on the weekly and they should ultimately have an associate work on the daily. And so if there's something that manager is doing every single day, you need to exponentially train the associate to be able to take on that task. Then if you're in a director capacity, it's something, what am I doing weekly? Because I should be focused on the monthly. And so in that scenario, you're saying, is there a task that I have to do every week? Is it taking out the trash? I need to, as my wife is the director of home services, she needs to hand that task off to someone that's responsible enough. Unfortunately, there's limited people that are responsible enough in the household, so we still have to assign that task. But you get the idea, right? And so I think that's what we look at is how frequently are you doing it and how consistent is that task? The more frequently you're doing it and the consistent of a task, if you have someone in your employ, you should develop them exponentially to understand why you do that task as frequently as you do, what the process is to achieve that to a proficiency level that is acceptable, and then ultimately hand that task off. And then they're now understanding that to a greater degree and growing exponentially.
Now, sometimes you have to make decisions in a business setting that short term cost the time or the resources to the business. You have to send someone away. You have to let someone go. You have to cut back their responsibilities. But sometimes those decisions actually are maybe painful in the short term, but long term better serve the organization, right? Now, talk a little bit about those type of decisions.
And this is the requirement of someone that's developing exponential leaders. Because if you're intending to build something for the long term, you have to think long term. And short term, it always hurts to let someone go, right? There's never been a time that that was a lot of fun. Because when we're at that point of decision where someone has to separate from an organization, many times it's been an obvious pattern that's developed over time. And so that happens, right? And so an analogy that I think is really relevant is we had in all of our houses, actually, because my wife loves daylilies. She loves daylilies, right? Because in the Midwest where we live, they're there. They don't require much water. They require some sun. And ultimately they grow and they're pretty hardy through the winter as well. And so we've always had daylilies. And so then I'm relatively impatient. So I'd rather just go buy a whole bunch of daylilies and say, look, the yard's done. However, when I first bought our first house 25 years ago, they said, "Oh, these daylilies, you can split them, and they'll actually grow and thrive." I said, "Really?" And so ultimately, we planted the daylilies, and they bloom. And then as it gets to the fall or some period of time, I can't exactly recall when, sometimes in the spring, you just subdivide them, and then you plant them.
You dig it up?
You dig it up and you split it right in half, and then you can
Huh.
plant 2 or 3, he said, from that same growth. And he said, give it a season or 2, right? So ultimately, what happens? You give a chance, a season or 2, 2 to 3 years of an employee that's there, and then you divide the work and the responsibility to then go there. And so I'm like, I remember taking that first daylily. I'm like, is he right? I mean, this guy, I mean, he was just trying to sell me, but I'm
That's for
thinking,
witchcraft.
yeah, he could have sold me 3 of these plants, but I like, well, there's other daylilies around the neighborhood, and I'll try it with half the plants because I
Yeah.
still have the other half, and I can always buy more and plant them again. And then sure enough, I went and I planted, and I divided into thirds, and you put it in an appropriate soil, a place there. And this is why it's important for Exponential, because if we did that and we didn't water it, if we did that and we didn't let the roots set, if we did that division and we didn't put all those pieces together, it would die. But instead, I got, a bag of that topsoil, put it in that hole, put that there. And then ultimately, I think there's 3 things that takes things to grow, at least at our house: sunlight, water, and prayer. And I really was on the third one because I knew I'd have to replant if that third one didn't come through. And so, sure enough, God honored that prayer, and it was able to grow. And then I looked the next year, like, wow, they all grew,
Mm.
even though they were much smaller. And then ironically, it covered way more space than the one single one covered over the period of time. And so that dividing the plants works in nearly everything. Initially, it's painful. I could hear that. I'm like, I'm breaking these apart. This is like death, right? I mean, it's cracking. And I mean, if we cut a third of us and put it in plant, we're not going to regrow
Yeah.
the other 2/3. And so, but that was absolutely the case. And that's how an organization works, especially as you're growing. And I've watched this as our organization grew. When I started this organization 17 plus years ago now, I remember doing everything. I mean, we had one department that did everything. Looking at them, I mean, that was, what do you need? I'm your, Swiss Army knife of business, right? And so whether it's selling franchises, supporting the franchisees, I did have one other person that was working closely with me that did some of the payroll processing and administrative tasks, because that's absolutely my weakest. I was an operational advisor. I worked on our fleet and insurance, and all of these things are familiar to you because they are all now departments. And so through that process, each and every year, I would do a vision trip. And it was a much smaller scale than it is now. And I do it twice a year now. And I'd look and I'd say, okay, what is the next department? What is the next part of that daylily? Which is the one that I need to pull apart from where I'm at so I can flourish and thrive? And so each and every year I'd assess that, and I'd say, okay, where should this best be planted? What part of the house, if we're using the analogy again, where in the organization is this best suited to be planted? And so then I would go plant that, and then give it the appropriate water, sunlight, and prayer in a business that's, financial resources, personnel resources, and consultation. And then it would begin to thrive. And so I saw that work. And I think because I was willing and able to make those tough decisions to divide my responsibility in that sense, or people from the organization, is really why we flourished. But it's really hard to do in the moment.
And those kind of decisions, you talk about how hard it is for a department that is used to work in a certain way, that has their own processes, everybody's comfortable with, and then you come in and say, I'm gonna, like you did with the daylilies, rip it apart and change it up. You get a lot of pushback on that, don't you?
Absolutely. No question about that. And because just as that daylily was screaming when I'm pulling it out and I had to go shovel the dirt and it's a lot of work, that daylily didn't want to wake up that morning and be divided in half. At the same time, that's the same thing with the department and organization. But it's my responsibility as a leader that intends to grow exponentially, that I have to take those divisions. And, it reminds me of a story of a franchisee that had been with us for 10 years. And he had 2 different markets, and both were doing marginally well. They were profitable and they were growing. At the same time, I remember having a conversation with him, and he's like, I either need to exit or, need to focus. And I said, well, what's your long-term goal? Right? Because you always have to discuss with an exponential leader that wants to be developed their long-term goal. Because if their goal is to retire, well, then don't divide, right? Just kind of ride it out, see the cycle. And then, that can be broken down over time by the mites and the ants, and that tree will be part of the fertile soil for the next person, right? But if you're ready to then subdivide and grow, that's the case. And so through that conversation, it was apparent he needed to sell off a market. And so he ended up selling off a market to another owner. And then as I've watched that over the last 3 to 4 years, his market has grown 4 times from where it was. And then the new market that someone else now owned grew 4 times.
Wow. Much more than the two markets together would have
More
done.
than the 2 markets together. So imagine, just for the sake of this analogy, that both were 50-50. So let's say, for simplicity, collectively they're doing 200,000 a month.
Mhm.
Now, in both cases, they're both doing over 500,000, or give or take 500,000 a
Wow.
month, and that doubled it.
Mhm.
Even though it was painful, because there's people that were on one side, didn't want
Mhm.
to change jobs. Personnel have ultimately changed that are
Sure.
able to do that, so you can elevate at the same time as that division worked in another organization. And that was, in that case, me being a small part of that decision of that leader to make that decision to sell off a market so he could exponentially grow.
So, talk about how leaders play a role in that type of change. It's hard, it can be challenging, you get a lot of pushback. There's a lot of emotional investment, right? And the way things work, because you built it up to this certain way, and not just on your part, but also on the team's part. So, talk about how a leader pushes through that, helps people see the long term, and makes that transition as smooth as possible.
So, first and foremost, the more selfish the leader is, the less likely it'll be successful.
Hmm.
And why do I say it that way? Because if you want to be liked, that's selfish.
Hmm.
If
It's
you
all
want to
about
make
you,
It's
right?
all about
Yeah.
you. I want to be loved by my people. I want them to think I'm the best boss they ever have. But if we look back in our careers and or our lives, the person that gave us everything we wanted, we don't consider long term our best boss. If that's all you care about is
Mhm.
being loved by your employees, you're not going to go divide that, because nobody likes that. Conversely, we look at the people that are good bosses that handle this well, that said they challenged me,
Mhm.
because we look to those who challenged me, and challenging can be different than being loved.
Oh, yeah.
And so, why is selfishness a key part of that? Because for me to challenge anyone, I have to be unselfish. I have to care enough about them to make them better, which means I can't care about myself more, because they're not going to like me in that moment. And I care so much about them that I'm willing to have the difficult conversation. And so ultimately, a leader that can minimize self interest and selfishness will be able to execute on exponential growth much better. And maybe, I don't even know, a selfish leader can exponentially grow, because they're going to want the credit of that person's success.
Right.
So, someone that is exponentially growing, I think the number one trait of that individual is ultimately to subdivide that. And so we see that often in sports coaching trees, because in those coaching trees, there's coaches that want to win for their own sake, right? They're going to say, I want multiple championships. And if you actually look at the champions, that the coaches that have won the most championships in any sport,
Mhm.
very rarely do they have a deep and broad coaching tree, because they want the acclaim and they're going to run into front of the team that's going to win.
A coaching tree is their organization, assistant coaches and strength coaches and all those things that
Right.
work for them.
They go on to other organizations to succeed, right? So you can see throughout multiple parts, different sports, and I won't, specifically speak to any, because you can research them on if you're interested, because the principle applies, that they work together as a cohesive team. They subdivide responsibility, and they don't take individual credit like this is the best coach ever. It's ultimately saying collectively we won as a team. The other subordinate coaches to the head coach then go on to be head coaches elsewhere
Mhm.
and re-employ that process. So here's what I would otherwise challenge you to collectively look at. How many coaching championships did an individual coach have, versus the total compilation of championships all the other coaches in that coaching tree had? And we never look at that. We look at, instead, oh, that's individual claim, and this person should be in the Hall of Fame. Instead of saying, this team came together universally, and over time, collectively, there was more championships and more lives enriched and more teams that had championships all the way through that process. And that is the effect of exponential leadership. And so why? Because we are a society that rewards the hero, not the developer.
Hmm.
We are a society that says you are the GOAT, and that is your individualized success.
Yeah.
Not you are the GOAT factory.
Right. Yeah.
Right? If we awarded people that were the GOAT factory, what would be the difference of the world? If we are the GOAT factory, now nobody goes to the GOAT factory, right? Who is the person pushing the GOAT factory?
Mhm.
We're only looking at the GOAT. But the person that should get credit is the GOAT factory, because they're getting 10 or 12 or 15 goats coming out every year.
I hear you talk a lot about others as you lead and not focusing on oneself, not worried about how you're viewed, how that's going to make me as a leader feel. Sounds a lot like humility. But humility is not something that is celebrated much in our society. In fact, I heard a leader say if you seek and pursue humility, you'll end up being the opposite.
Right.
So, talk about that balance with humility and the need to be in front and center as a leader.
Yeah. And so, first of all, I think, as I often mention on this podcast and throughout my life, much of my philosophy is based on biblical principles. And so, in the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And that flies in the direct face of what our culture is saying right now. In fact, even our language is around self interest. And I believe that Steve Jobs was in part successful because of one single letter, and that is I. iPhone, iPod, iPad, iTunes. I, 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 I. And that is saying he knows selfishness sells. Then we look at vernacular that's been created over the last 20 years. Self-E, Facebook, right? And even MySpace preceding that, right? Everything is about the self. And if we look at this, we need to center ourselves, right? And you hear that in pop culture. And I look at that, invert those words, be self-centered, right? And then we look at the deployment of that. Whatever circumstances we see that people are not volunteering or sacrificing of their time for anyone else more now than ever in the history of time, right? They are paying for services or getting paid for services, not volunteering their services. When we pay for service, that's actually a selfish act because we're saying, I want this and I want to control it. And the monetary value is going to control it. And if I get paid, I'm doing it as a compensation instead of out of the goodness of my heart. And so ultimately, that is saying that we are self-interested. So on the converse of that is humility, saying that I will sacrifice anything that comes from this for the humility. And so the last shall be first and the first shall be last. What does that mean is I believe the number one leadership trait in the next generation in the future, and I would say even throughout history, is humility. And we do not promote humble leaders. We don't value humble leaders. We do not communicate humble leaders. And part of that reason is because a true humble leader does not want to be recognized.
Right.
And so, again, it's not only counterculture, but it's counter to the environment that leader thrives in. And quite frankly, if we look at the notoriety achieved by those leaders that were humble leaders, that actually can distract them from their purpose because they're fighting culturally to be notified of that or recognized in that case. As well. And so humility is the number one success factor for a leader, in my opinion. And if we look throughout history of the most humble leaders, I mean, you can talk George Washington, you can talk Abraham Lincoln, and others that had exponential growth in their investment of time. And Jesus, absolutely. You would see humility was the aligning capacity for all of them, right? Because they had different eras, they had different strengths, they had different things they're leading, but humility they had different educational development, but I would say the one thing that ties them all together is humility.
Exponential growth. Thank you once again, folks, for listening to us, for tuning in. Thank you, Reed, for sharing with us. Preview coming up on episode 4. Episode 4, provisional. All right, today we talked about exponential and exponential growth, exponential leadership. Episode 4 is going to be provisional. Leaders provide what others need. Again, back to this humility, what others need instead of what I need. But we want to thank you again for tuning in here to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I'm Art Calderon, and until we see you next time, be purposeful.
I always get the last word. That's your favorite part, Art. No extra money for that rhyme there. But ultimately, if you are someone that wants to develop exponentially, seek people with humility and have humility. That is the number one thing to focus on. And in fact, it is also the number one trap. I would challenge you to look inside and say, am I operating out of a position of self-interest and pride? If you are doing that, stop the podcast right here and say, I'm not ready to develop leaders. I need to look inside and say, can I lead with humility? Because you will not have an exponential effect if you do not focus first on your humility, self-interest, and pride. So today, do a personal inventory. Am I proud? Am I doing this for the wrong reasons? Because in the end, you will be dissatisfied with the results, predominantly because of your pride and self-interest. Focus on, lean into humility, and you will be the better for it. Until next time.